So we're up to the third class that Rav Ginsburg gave at Torah Nefesh. And this one is huge in terms of content, in terms of length. I think it was like 4 hours. I don't remember how people, they weren't used to this yet. You know,
Wow.
in the old days, we used to sit with him like for 6-7 hours sometimes. And, you know, he wouldn't even take a break. He would just go on for hours and hours. So he was a little bit more, I guess, nicer to the crowd there. It was only 3 or 4 hours. I remember the class, but... So this class is really about one topic that's two, and you could say that the topic is humanity. What does it mean to be human? And there's a lot of different meanings to this word. If we would have to translate it into Hebrew, so people say today enoshiyut. It's one of the names. There are 4 synonyms used to designate a person in Hebrew. Right? Adam, Gever, and Ish, and Enosh. So those 4 names, each one of them means something else, and there's a lot to discuss about it. He doesn't get into it so much in this class. But the one that's most used for designating humanity, meaning be human, in the sense of caring, compassionate, and so on, and also the human condition, is enoshiyut. It's the one that means, it was the name of Adam's grandson, Enosh. He was the son of Seth, and through him, basically, all of humanity continued to a certain extent, not fully, because Cain had descendants also, and Cain's great granddaughter, the 7th generation from him, was Naamah, who married Noach. And so all the children that came out of Noach were actually descendants of both Seth and Cain. Abel did not have any descendants. So from Seth's lineage, it's called Enosh. We're called Bnei Enosh. And in Aramaic, when you want to say person, just a person, it's Anash. And it comes from that word. Usually the understanding is that the word Ish in Hebrew is actually a derivative of Enosh also. But in the Torah, the word Ish appears before Enosh. When Eve says why she calls Cain by his name, she says, Ki kaniti ish et avaya. She says, I have possessed a man, meaning by having a child, I now have, through giving birth, I've now tapped into, as it were, to the divine image and brought it down into a person. Right?
Who was saying this?
Eve,
Eve.
when she gave birth to Cain.
The divine image?
Yeah, the divine image. She was hoping. So we're going to be talking about humanity, and there's going to be 2 different aspects to it. One is going to be, and we'll probably finish this in this class this time, maybe not all of it, but almost all of it, is about weaknesses. Okay, and the title of this part of the class is "Weaknesses Are Not Faults." And the Rav's argument was basically, I'll say the introduction now and then we'll get into the details, is that what leads people into so many problems mentally is that they treat their weaknesses as if they're faults. So you could say that they, one aspect of it would be that they blame themselves. But mostly, and we'll see this later on, the weakness becomes like a klipa noga. It becomes like a intermediate husk, which can be positive or negative. It can go in either direction. And we tend to judge ourselves too harshly, and then the weakness becomes a sign of guilt, a sign of improper behavior, whatever. For instance, classic example is that children whose parents have divorced blame themselves. Now, it's not that having divorced parents is not a weakness. It is, but it's not a fault. It's not the same thing. So you weren't at fault, but the child has to explain somehow, or give themselves some kind of a theory about why this happened. And since the child is still self-involved and doesn't see the rest of the world, and certainly doesn't see his parents as independent human beings, right, that have their own choices and their own lives, so the child immediately projects himself onto the situation and says, this was because of me. If a parent, Chas v'Shalom, dies, it's the same thing. The child feels that it's shameful. And this is a big deal. This is at the root of so many people whose parents passed away when they were young, that they carry shame. And the shame is hard to understand, right? I don't know. Did yours?
No, but why would a kid feel shame if a parent died? There are not many women, and they just go, oh, my mother, like, poor me, but never shame.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Shame because you didn't have a parent?
Yeah,
And everyone
because
else
their
was.
life wasn't real like everybody
Yeah,
else's.
because,
And then it
everybody's
becomes-
got a perfect
Not
family.
shame like the parents died because of them.
Oh, no.
No.
Divorce is
Okay.
because because I did something wrong. But
Okay,
but
I didn't.
But the death of a parent is more a feeling of shame that I'm abnormal. And I'm abnormal, that means that I'm abnormal. Now, not having a parent is a very strong weakness. It's one of the most terrible weaknesses you can grow up with. Nothing short of being handicapped physically. But,
Is
as
it
we'll
because
see.
you're different?
Because you're just not like everyone else.
So chaser.
I think it's,
I felt ashamed that I was Jewish. I was a
Right,
family Jewish
right,
kid.
right.
It was just uncomfortable and
That happens a lot. So whatever is a weakness has a tendency, can easily fall into becoming a fault. And so he says that at the root of so many of the mental problems that people have as adults, or things that developed further, was some weakness that transformed into a fault in the person's mind. And there are two ways to go. I've talked about this in the past, but here we're going to go into it with a lot more detail. Okay, so that's the general title of our topic, of the first topic that we're going to talk about in this class. Then after that, in the second part, which will take more than one class, I think we'll take 3 or 4, we're going to discuss the different aspects of what it means to be human, because to be human is first of all to live with your weaknesses. That's what it means, right? Because as a human being, you're weak. And there's a very strong statement that he said here in the middle of the class. He said that if you don't have any weaknesses, then you're Superman, right? Even Superman has a weakness, kryptonite, right? But if in theory, if you don't have any weaknesses, you're not a human. You're a Superman. And we don't like Superman, he says. Because Superman is some kind of abomination that is related to a Malek. It's related to a person who has a tremendous amount of hubris and cannot see their own problems. Right? There's no such thing as a person without weaknesses. Or if you're really not human and you're like an angel, so you're also not part of the human race, right? You're something else. And we're here to be human. We are. What?
what about his side?
He still has weaknesses. He has many weaknesses, not just one. Like everybody else, he has weaknesses. Weaknesses are somewhere else. They're not what you and I would call a weakness, right? Maybe you and I would think about this and say, this is not a weakness at all. This is actually, I wish those were my weaknesses. Yeah, but he still has weaknesses. And you see that in the end, of course, as great as the tzaddik might be, he suffers the same fate that everybody does. There's no difference. Okay, so that's the general title. So in the second part, we're going to look at the different meanings of this word man. Okay, and to begin with, we need a short introduction that has to do with what is man stand for in Chassidus? What exactly do we mean by that? So to explain this, we're going to look at the Mishnah, which unfortunately I didn't bring the translation of. I translated it at home, and I didn't think to bring the translations for some reason. It's a Mishnah in the third chapter of Avos. And maybe you have a Pirkei Avot in English here?
I do.
Yeah, so I'll read it from there. It'll be a lot easier than for me to try to translate it on the fly. Any sitter will also have it, but even a sitter will.
In the path of our fathers here?
I don't know. I have no idea if that's Pirkei Avos. Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I don't think that. Oh, maybe it is. Maybe it is. Yeah, it has translations. Okay. No, I only need to find the Mishnah. Yeah. Okay, so this is from Rabbi Akiva. It's Mishnah 13 in chapter 3. And it reads like this. Rabbi Akiva used to say, "Beloved is man, for he was created in the image of God. An even greater expression of love is that it was made known to him that he was created in God's image." Meaning that not only did he have the image of God, but he also knew that he had the image of God. We're going to get into this a little bit later. As it's stated, for in the image of God he made man. Then, he says, this is all Rabbi Akiva, "Beloved are the people of Israel, for they are called children of God. An even greater expression of love is that it was made known to them that they are called children of God. As it is said, you are the children of Hashem, your God." The third part, also by Rabbi Akiva, "Beloved are the people of Israel, for a precious article was given to them. An even greater expression of love is that it was made known to them that they were given a precious article." What are we talking about? What's the precious article that we received? As it is said, "I have given you good teaching, do not forsake my Torah." Okay? So what do we have here? We have three parts to what Rabbi Akiva said. And remember, the Rabbi Akiva is the son of converts. Very important to know that the man who was the pillar of the oral tradition, he taught everyone that basically that we have. There were two schools at the time, Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva. But the Mishnah that we have is mostly the renditions given over in the Academy of Rabbi Akiva. So he's called the pillar of the oral tradition. And he was a son of converts. And the reason this is important is because in this Mishnah, you see that he begins with man, and then he talks about two levels of Israel, call it, of being Jewish. What's the level of being a man, an Adam, person? That means having the image of God. And then there is a second level, which is becoming or being named Israel. And then there's a third level, which is the Torah. So how can we understand this? What's going on here? So the usual explanation is that the level of man is what we call the intellectual soul. And this is something that we haven't spoken about very much. We've spoken about to some extent, but not very much. What does it mean? What does the intellectual soul mean? It means that the intellectual soul is an intermediate between the animal soul and the divine soul. And so there are two types of, let's call it intellectual soul. There's the intellectual soul that's, let's call it, influenced by the Torah. There's the intellectual soul that's not influenced by the Torah. But even the intellectual soul that's not influenced by the Torah is called the image of God. Meaning that if you have to some extent an intellectual soul, intellectual soul means that you're sane, you're not crazy, you're not fanatic, you're not, how should I say, overly impetuous, that you have some presence of mind, right? You're a human being, then that's already called being a human being. That's already being a human. What does it mean that it's in between? So we've explained a few times in the past that when the child is born, we don't have an intellectual soul. Meaning we don't have an intellect. We only have emotions. We have feelings, experiences. But as time passes and you mature, so you begin to grow a brain. Your brain begins to function. And as the brain functions, there's more and more room for the intellectual soul. So you begin to make decisions, hopefully, not based on your impulses, but on some kind of rational thought. Right? So there's the famous cookie jar experiment, right? Or the cookie experiment, I don't remember what the classic name is. That one of the best predictors of success in life was that they put a child in front of cookies and you say, you can have this cookie now, or if you're willing to wait half an hour, you'll get something better later. And the children who are able to wait, to delay their gratification, they, after 50 years of following them, they were seen to be much more successful than the children who couldn't. What is that? That is the intellectual soul working. Meaning my intellect tells me that it's worthwhile, if I believe the person. If I don't believe the person, of course I better eat the cookie because there's nothing coming in half an hour. But if I believe them to any extent, and I have good reason to believe them because they're a reputable person, and they're an adult, and I believe adults, so if I'm able to postpone, to delay my gratification, it's because my intellect is telling me it's better to receive more in half an hour than to receive something impulsive right now. So that's the beginning of the intellectual soul. Of course, the intellectual soul is much more than that. It's not just this simple principle that it's better to delay gratification in order to get more later. There's other many principles that I learn over life, right? One of them is reasoning and don't get angry at people, and even if you want to curse them out, don't do that, and all these things that the intellect understands and tells the animal soul, be quiet. I'll decide based on my intellect and not based on my impulses. The only problem is that the intellect is an outgrowth. So the intellect is serving the animal soul. If the gratification after would not be 2 cookies, then it's not clear that the child would choose it. If the gratification after half an hour would be, well, you don't get any cookies, but instead, let's say it's a 4-year-old and they don't understand what money is. I'm going to give you $10 with which you can buy 8 cookies, let's say. But he doesn't understand what $8 mean. So because the intellect is serving the animal soul, the need for gratification is to receive physical gratification. You can't give him something spiritual or something that stands for something else. All the more so that you can't tell them, say it's an older child, 10 years old, 12 years old. Well, I'm not going to give you any cookies, but instead I'm going to teach you a Mishnah by heart. Okay, Michael Toivis, I don't need another Mishnah. I want the cookie. Why? Because my intellect is serving my animal soul. And it's just how it is. That's how we build ourselves. That's how the human being is built. Eventually, at some point, we hope that by learning Torah, the ideals for which the intellect is working will change. And they won't be ideals serving the animal soul. They'll become ideals serving something higher. What's the higher? The higher is the divine soul. So here we have this intellectual soul. So is it good or is it bad that we have an intellectual soul? it's intermediate. It can go both ways. So much can it go both ways that there's a verse in Proverbs that says, I believe it's in Proverbs, it says, Chachamim hem lehara, that there is wisdom that is for evil. And that's not hard to see.
That just happened
That
yesterday.
there's a lot. What?
In the old city.
Why was that wisdom?
That guy that was a big whatever
Murdered.
professor and everything murdered.
A teacher.
Yeah, he was a big like that was a screwed up.
A teacher of hate.
Art teacher? Well,
A teacher of hate.
He was only 20
Yeah.
years old.
No, whatever. He's
The
a
boy
teacher.
was, I'm saying the guy
But-
who did it was a screwed up intellect.
There's no intellect.
There's art.
There's no intellect.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you can say he's a teacher. What's he teaching? Nonsense. There's no intellect.
It's
Maybe
screwed-
compared to a
isn't it-
rabbit, he
But
has
doesn't it take,
intellect.
it's a screwed up intellect.
Yeah, so
I mean,
obviously.
completely.
But
Obviously.
he was a teacher like in university. didn't
But
he?
we
Yes.
don't have to go
No,
to
I'm
yesterday.
sorry.
Yesterday is not an
Yeah, yeah.
example.
But
The
we're
example
talking about
is
Jews
the
now?
example is the Germans.
Yeah.
That's the
Right.
perfect example. Look at the amount of intellect that went into that murderous machine called the Nazi party.
And even
Look at what they, and it's on. You can't begin to understand. You know, you can argue about other people about whether they meant well or didn't mean well, but there you have a perfect example of somebody whose only purpose is evil, and they use all the technology, all the brain power of the human species at the time to do that. They invented new ways to kill people in order to propagate their evil. So, intellect is weakness. What do we mean that it can be that it's a weakness? It depends where it goes. It's a klipas noga. It's what we call an intermediate husk. It can go in the direction of becoming a fault, and it can go in the direction of becoming a virtue, depending on who it's serving. Is it serving my animal soul, or is it serving my divine soul? If it's serving my animal soul, so it's still the same intellect. It's still very smart, or as smart as you are, as good as your brain power is. And it's serving me to, somebody would say cookies are not exactly evil. But relative to learning a Mishnah, one is self-serving, and the other is serving God. The one is taking the mind and using it for mere survival or pleasures, physical pleasures, and the other is taking the mind, taking the intellect, and using it to build a ladder up to the highest realms of the heavens. And it's two different pictures of what is man, right? How do you define a human? So the intellectual soul is a very good example of something that's a weakness. It can be a weakness. Okay? It's hard to think of it in the beginning as a weakness, because you think of it, half a mind is probably the best thing in the world. But the fact that we can think, how could we be human beings without thinking, without rationalizing, without being able to think logically? We couldn't be human beings. But it's not exactly like that, because the mind serves a purpose. And it depends which purpose it serves. So so why would we call it a weakness? So that we'll have to get into as we go through this, and see different characterizations of what does it mean to have a weakness. We started with two that are pretty common, of a child growing up with divorced parents or without a parent that passed away. Those are weaknesses. But let's take what is perhaps the most well-known example in Chassidus, because this was a story that happened to the Tzemach Tzedek with his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe. And the story was that the Tzemach Tzedek was learning with his Melamed the book of Vayikra, right? That's where you start. You start with Leviticus, and the first word is Vayikra, and he called to him. And the word ends, Vayikra is Vav Yud Kuf Reish Aleph, and it ends with a minor, with a small Aleph. So The Melamed, why is there a small Aleph here? The Melamed didn't know exactly what to answer, I guess. And then the Tzemach Tzedek, either he knew this or he saw it later. I don't remember the story exactly. He said, the book of Chronicles begins with the word Adam. The first verse of Chronicles is Adam Shet Enosh. The beginning of Chronicles gives the chronicles of mankind. So the first word is Adam. And the Aleph of Adam is a major Aleph. It's a big Aleph. It's 4 times the size of a regular Aleph. So he said, why is it that here the Aleph is small? When God calls Moshe Rabbeinu into the tabernacle, the Aleph is small, and by Adam it's big. And so the Melamed sent him to the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe taught him something, and he said like this, that by Adam, the Aleph represents the image of God in you. And Adam, as we heard, he knew that he had the image of God in him. He knew his Maila, he knew his virtue. His virtue is that he is capable of being godly. He's capable of acting in a holy way. But that was his downfall. Because he felt that it was his virtue, meaning he held tovah le'atzmo. He felt that it was in his own merit that he was different than all the other creatures, that he was able to be godly, he was able to act in a different way, to surmount his animal nature. So he became like God, knowing good and evil. And he said, who better than me to be like God? Because I have the image of God in me. And so he fell for what the snake was selling him. And then he sinned. But Moshe Rabbeinu, why is Hashem inviting him into the tabernacle? What does Moshe do in the tabernacle? He's not a Kohen, he's not a priest. What Moshe Rabbeinu does in the tabernacle is he hears the prophecy from between the cherubim that are on the ark. So for Moshe Rabbeinu, going into the tabernacle means receiving Torah. Receiving the prophecy that becomes the Torah. And there, the Aleph is small because Moshe Rabbeinu was humble. Meaning, even though he had maybe the greatest image of God, and we'll explain this in another moment more exactly, even though he had the greatest image of God, he was humble about it. How humble was he? So he was so humble that he felt that there's no other human being on the face of the planet who is less than him. He felt less than everyone, especially the way that's explained in Chassidus, that he saw all the way to the end of the generations, and he saw that as much faith as he had, the simplest, sincere Jew in the times of the end of history, like what we're approaching, will have more faith than him. So that's how humble he was. And even regular people now have more faith than Moshe Rabbeinu had. So Moshe Rabbeinu had to have some faith to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. It's not a simple thing. You're taking responsibility for 6 million people, maybe 3 million people. And you have to convince them that we're going to receive the Torah, we're going to Eretz Yisrael. There's a lot of faith that you need to have to do this. So it says even the simplest Jew today has more faith than Moshe Rabbeinu does. That's what he saw. What was Moshe Rabbeinu receiving? He was receiving the Torah. The Torah is the source of what raises the intellect to the divine. That's what makes the intellectual soul serve the divine. That's what we said before. Either the intellectual soul is going to serve my animalistic survival needs, my needs for satisfaction, pleasure, and so on, or my intellect is going to serve my higher self, my divine soul. What teaches my intellect about the divine soul? The Torah. So as much as Moshe Rabbeinu was prepared, he was the wisest of men at the time, and he was prepared, his intellect was made to be able to understand the Torah. For him, it was like a weakness. He understood it as a weakness, and a weakness needs to be strengthened. This begins to be the key of how you need to treat a weakness.
How did Moshe feel that his intellect was a weakness?
Because the intellect can fall to serve the animal soul. If you see it as weak, if you see it as something that needs rectification, then it can become a virtue. But Adam, who only saw his intellect, his ability to be more than the other animals, as a virtue for himself, as if it's a strong feature,
Right.
it's a virtue that I have,
Right.
that caused him to fall.
Okay.
That caused him to sin. Because by definition, the weaknesses were meant to be strengthened. They weren't meant to be seen as strong. You don't carry yourself as if you're strong. On the contrary, when you recognize that things are a weakness, they can become a strength, they can become a virtue. But if you don't recognize them as weak, if you don't recognize call it the risk involved or the danger involved,
I get that
and
side
these-
of it. I don't get the Moshe side of it, how he was weak in his
no, he
thinking.
recognized himself. He recognized the intellect as being weak, and therefore he needs to hear the divine word in order to take his intellect and strengthen it. And make it serve the higher purpose. Otherwise, he's just convinced that if I have a strong intellect, people who are very, very smart find it very difficult to hear Torah.
Right.
The smarter you are, the more
To get
difficult it is.
rectifying the ego.
Right?
Very
Because
good.
why? Because you feel I'm already smart. I already have the virtue. The virtue is my intellectual understanding.
Right.
I understand so much. Why would I want to listen to something else? I already understand everything. But Moshe Rabbeinu treated it as a weakness. He saw it as a weakness. Even his humility was a weakness. It's not good to be overly humble. Is it good to be overly humble? It's not a good thing. If a person is overly humble, right? There's an v'tanut shel sheker, it's called.
Okay, no, but
Humility of-
really understanding that everything is Hashem doing it, like we learn, that's not overly humble, that's just giving it to Hashem.
Yeah, but here we're talking about, for instance, you have to go be a shaliach, let's say.
Okay.
And the person says, who am I to go do something like that? I don't know how to speak to people. I don't know this, I don't know that.
Okay.
And the Rebbe comes and says, but you're exactly the person that I need. It's because you don't feel that you know how to speak to people. What are you going to say? You're going to say, when I was able to speak to somebody and convince them, and we became good friends, and this, that, who did this? Not me, because I don't have those abilities. It's Rebbe who did it. It's God who did it. It's my divine soul. But the moment the person feels that he has a strength already,
Okay.
then he cannot break the hold that his ego has on his strength.
Okay.
And he feels that it's him all the time. And so he's not able, like Moshe Rabbeinu, to hear what is being said above. He simply can't hear it. He's always in his own thoughts. He's never listening to something beyond.
Right, but why did he need to strengthen it? It seems like it was a strength, that the weakness is a strength.
No, because you need to strengthen the weakness. You can't leave it the way it is. If you don't develop the intellect, if you leave it weak, meaning I don't know where do we see the motion that he has an intellect that's weak? That's how he called it. That we say that he was famous for saying he told Pharaoh that the plague of the firstborn would be at midnight. He said at about midnight. Why at about midnight? Why not tell him exactly? Because God told him it will be at midnight. So why don't you say exactly? So he says, maybe they'll come to me and they'll say it wasn't exactly midnight. They'll calculate it differently. It's, it was just a fluke. It wasn't really, you didn't know. So he says, to begin with, I don't know. I don't know exactly when. Yeah.
Is the awareness, though, of the weakness a strength?
Yes.
Okay.
That's
so,
what it's not the strength itself, but it's what allows it to strengthen.
right. So,
Right.
but where is the category of, like, what is it, muda'a, like awareness of?
Yes, it's awareness that there are categories of being human.
Mm-hmm.
There are different things in which we are human, meaning we are anush, we are weak. And the more we recognize that these categories are weaknesses, the more we can strengthen them. But if we can't recognize that they're a weakness, then we can't strengthen them. On the other hand, the other side of the coin is that if you take the weakness and you leave it as it is, you'll eventually be convinced that it's a fault. And that's the other side of the coin, which is problematic. So in the end, really, you have to stay in a state of being strong through a recognition that your weaknesses play a role. So let's say this is a counter-argument to what's going on now in the world. In the world now, for the last 10 years, the biggest thing is Marvel, right? All the superheroes that came out of Marvel Comics. And so DC Comics has its own thing and whatever. The most common thing you hear, I think, about self-image is, what's your superpower? That's how people describe it now. You guys aren't, like, I don't know, maybe so much into it. But that's the way it's being described. What's your superpower? But the real question is not what is your superpower. What is your weakness turned strength? That's the real question. Do you have a weakness that you were able to transform, to strengthen, to make it into something that helps you, something that moves you ahead? So the question really is identifying the weaknesses. That's what makes us human. But those weaknesses were not meant to be faults. That's the other side of the equation. It's because people are so afraid of weaknesses. So they ask, so what's your what are you great at? Right? What are you really great at?
The way that transformation happens is by serving the divine. That's the
Right.
difference,
Right.
which way it goes,
Right.
paying attention, identifying, and serving the divine soul.
Exactly. So in the next few classes, we're going to look at the different categories of these weaknesses. There's many different categories. But before I forget, because this is coming up next week is Chanukah, what do we say about the Maccabim, about the Maccabees? Masarta giborim beyad chalashim. The brave into the hands of the weak. And when you think about it, what kind of a praise is that? What kind of a praise is that to say that the Greeks were the brave, or the mighty, giborim, mighty,
Great into the weak, he said.
and you deliver them into the hands of the Maccabees who are weak. But that's exactly the point, that the sages are not looking at the war as just a physical struggle. They see it as a cultural struggle. And it's the same struggle that David had with Goliath. David has a weakness. What's his weakness? He's small. But when you recognize your weakness, you can turn it into a power. You can turn it into something that serves godliness. And by serving godliness, right, there's a lot of examples of it in that story. Maybe the most famous one is that he took 5 pieces of stone, chalukei nachal, and he put them into his slingshot. But he only shot 1. So the question is, why did he need 5? So one of the answers that the Medrash gives is that the 5 became 1. The 5 stones that he took became 1 stone. Sort of like what happened to Yaakov, but in a different sense. The idea being, and this has been in Kabbalah, this is developed a lot, that this is one of the kavanos of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That the 5 words, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem, those are the 5 stones.
Wow.
And they become one. So even when you're saying the Shema, one of the things to imagine is that these 5 words, Hero, Israel, Havaya is our God, Havaya is, right? Those 5 words, they're not 5 in English, but they are 5 in Hebrew. They become Echad, they become one. Because that's the main thing, that everything is one. So David came with his weakness on the one hand. Why is it such a weakness? Because I think we mentioned this in one of the previous classes, that the atheists used to describe the, let's call them monotheists, the idolaters, the polytheists, used to describe monotheists, meaning us, as atheists. Because we have no God. Where's your God? Show me your God. Where do you keep it? So you must have no God. Think about it. It's a weakness. I don't have anything to protect. It becomes a very big weakness when you think about, so who exactly is this God that we're worshiping, and how do we agree on what he wants? When it's an idol, it's relatively simple. Yeah, somebody wants to ask from here, so you need to unmute yourself and ask.
Okay, thank you. I'm just wondering how we understand this in the context of, I don't remember who the quote's from in Torah, but more important than knowing our weaknesses, we need to know our strengths.
I don't know. Where's that from?
Okay, I don't remember.
Okay, if you find it and you see and you show me the context, I can try to think about it. But
Okay.
As it is, I can't translate it right now in my mind to something that I recall. It could be that it is, but I need to see the context.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. The moment that we begin to think about it this way, then something very interesting happens to the whole therapeutic process. Normally, we think of the therapeutic process as trying to get rid of weaknesses. You have to fix things. So, if you are weak at something, so let's see how we can strengthen it. For instance, if you have low self-esteem, so we need to raise your self-esteem. How do we raise it? But it could very well be that the fact that you are not so good, let's say, socially, and you recognize that as a weakness, that itself could be your biggest asset. Therapy doesn't have to come and paint an ideal that we're supposed to reach, but rather it could be, what can we learn about our abilities from our weaknesses? So I want to give an example that just was it made a lot of noise in the last about a month ago or 2 weeks ago. There was a Breslover who passed away. I don't remember his name right now, but he was quite famous. he used to go all over Israel with his drums. He's like, and he did drum circles. And he and his wife were, they were one of the first that had these vehicles that had, big,
The bands.
the vans. Yeah. They were like that, but I'm not sure exactly if they were spreading joy and whatever else. But he was very particular about the drums. And everywhere he went, he really got to a lot of young people. Because, when you're young, drums make you move. I guess when you're old also, but when you're young, you need it. You need something to move you. So he used to do drum circles, and he used to have a lot of drums in his van. And whenever they went to schools, whatever, and they really found purpose for a lot of and helped a lot of young people, normalize to a certain extent, if you want. And he passed away. He had I think he had cancer, and it took about a year, and he passed away. And Yedidia Meir, who's well-known columnist, so he wrote about his encounter with him about 7 or 8 years ago. And he said he came to ask him, how is it that he's always so happy and so joyful and spreading joy everywhere? And he told him something amazing. I didn't even remember the story, truth is. He's my age, so I remember something about it, but I don't remember fully. Maybe you guys remember more. His parents were in the Lockerbie plane.
Oh, wow.
You remember that?
What plane?
Oh, is it
The
the
TWA flight that was blown up over
Where
Lockerbie.
they killed themselves.
Yeah.
Blown
Oh
up
my
by-
gosh.
Was
Over
that-
England, right? It was
Yeah,
from
yeah.
England.
So I guess it was like 1982, 3, 4,
What happened?
not
Was
sure.
it a terrorist attack?
Oh, I thought
Yeah.
you meant the one for the towers. It was
No.
Okay.
We were talking about in the early 80s.
Okay.
It was a TWA flight. It was and his parents were on that flight.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
But what
And so he
happened
was
after that?
11 or 12,
Oh my gosh.
and his parents didn't come back.
Oh,
Oh my
okay.
gosh.
And he says he went from one home to the next, and he says his whole childhood was completely messed up. And eventually he became a Baal Tshuva, and he got married, and he had 10 children, and he did all this, and he was so well known. I mean, he's really everywhere. It can't be that you've never seen him. You'll see his face, you'll say, I've seen this guy once.
Uh-huh.
And so he says, you think it's easy for me. I'm telling you that this is what keeps me alive.
Oh my gosh.
All this joy that I spread is how I stay alive.
Wow.
This is not natural at all to me. When I wake up in the morning, I don't want to wake up. I have no interest in living. And it doesn't he says it hasn't changed for years. He says sometimes there's better days. But in principle, I don't want to be here.
Oh my gosh.
And it's a struggle to get out of bed. It's a struggle to do everything. And I do this because this is what keeps me alive. This is what keeps me sane. So that's an extreme example, but that is a weakness, tremendous weakness. Didn't lose just one parent, lost both on the same day, at the same moment. That almost never happens. Unless it's like an accident like that or a terrorist attack or whatever. And he turned that into his life. That weakness, that humanity of his willingness to accept it, and not to try to hide it, but to try to work with it and say, so what do I do next? So what do I do with this feeling? I understand that there are people out there who feel the same way that I feel. And I need to get to them. And that's my mission in life. Because I've seen what joy does for me. So now I understand what it will do for others. And this is an extreme example, but it's the same idea. That the moment that you recognize the weakness, and you recognize it as your humanity, then the weakness itself becomes your superpower. The weakness is where all your strength comes from. Now, in a certain sense, that is the story of Superman in a strange way, because the kryptonite is where he came from, right? But it's so convoluted there, it's hard to unravel the symbolism. The symbolism here is very easy. That thing which makes me human is where I can shine. Because there I need to strengthen myself all the time. And strengthen myself is exactly what I need to do in this lifetime. But in those places where I feel strong, where I feel superhuman maybe even, so in those places I won't strengthen myself. I won't make an effort. In fact, not only will I not make an effort, but like by Adam, it could turn into my downfall. Because I feel that I've already mastered that. That's already easy. That's given. When you're like that, you could think of, when you're like that, looking at the weaknesses, you can think of therapy as not being about, let's make up for what is missing, but rather let's identify where your weaknesses are and think about how we strengthen them, how we use them to move you forward. We're not trying to get rid of them. A lot of the weaknesses are permanent. You can't get rid of them. You'll have them forever. Okay. Moshe Rabbeinu's big problem was permanent, right? From the time he was a little child, he burnt his tongue, he burnt his vocal cords, whatever he burnt, and that was it. Kvad peh v'kvad lashon. He has a problem speaking, and yet he's the greatest orator of all times. How is that possible? Because it's not him speaking. It's the Shekhinah speaking out of his throat. But only a person who can't speak well, I don't know if he couldn't speak at all, I don't know what would happen, but who could not speak well, who had either a stutter or some other disfigurement that didn't allow him to speak clearly and loudly and so on, only a person like that could speak with the divine presence out of his throat. Okay. So this is a classic case of the weaknesses, our humanity, being the stepping stone to what we can really do in life. So what we'll see in the next few times is, first of all, we'll see the 5 times. The word weak is very weak in the Tanakh. It only appears 5 times. So first of all, we'll look at the 5 times that it appears. And we'll see what we can learn from each one of these times. And after that, we'll look at 13 different meanings of the word man, human. What does it mean? And those, you could say, are the categories of weakness that we all carry. And so this is a great tool because you can almost home in with anyone on where exactly do you feel your weakness, in which one of these. And that's the place where you can add the divine. That's where you can really touch on the divine. In the same place where Moshe Rabbeinu's humility is what allows him to enter into the Holy of Holies and hear God's words. As the sages say, be careful of the children of the poor, for out of them the Torah will come. What do they mean by poor? If you have someone who comes from a family where they're not very smart, there's no rabbis in the family, there's no big people in the family, there's simple common folk. And there's a child there who was growing up. He feels that we're not important, we're nothing special. That type of person will master the Torah. Because he doesn't hold himself to have anything. He hasn't inherited anything. He doesn't have anything from his parents, from his grandparents, no one. The person was like that was Rav Ovadia. And he came from a family like that. But his father had a store, like a dry goods store, I think. And one of the Rosh Yeshiva of Puat Yosef recognized him as a young child. He said to the father, look, I'll pay you to let him come and learn in my yeshiva. The father said, no, I need him for the store. He says, I'll pay you a lot. And he got him out of there. But his whole life, he didn't have anything. He's poor. He's poor in his knowledge, he's poor in his self-image, he's poor in all these things.
Did this rabbi recognize?
Yeah, he heard
his strength?
he saw it.
He saw it. Wow.
Saw it. But Rabbi Vaga apparently didn't hold from himself at all. So he spent all his hours learning because he's no one. He's a no one. He's a nobody. So nobody doesn't have anything to prove. So he can learn all he wants. Eventually, it turned out to be a superpower. Nobody knew. Yeah. Let's finish with one last thing. There's a saying. Yeah.
What? I'm just curious. What's the lashon in the Tanakh for weak?
Chalash.
It's kalash. Okay.
Yeah. Chet lamed shin. We'll see. Vayishlach. The Tanya mentions a new understanding of because we were now talking about parents. B'mai have avuch zahir tfei. With what was it, or in what area was your father most careful? That's the meaning of this passage in the Talmud. What does it mean? It's like someone was asking someone, with what was he makpid especially? What mitzvah did he perform with the utmost care? You could say instead of being careful, like with care, with sensitivity. The word zahir in Hebrew means to be careful, but in Aramaic, zahir means also to shine. So the Tanya says that really what this means is that every person has a particular area in which they can shine, and you need to find out what it is. Zahir,
Like
Zayin,
Zohar?
Hey, Yud,
Is
Reish.
it like Zohar? Is it
Like
just
Zohar,
Oh
same
my
thing.
gosh.
It's
That's
luminance,
What?
splendor, shining.
Wow.
But again, the meaning in the Gemara means, very simple, is what did you pay more attention to? With what was you careful about? But because Zahir also means shines, so the Alter Rebbe says from this we learn that every person has a particular mitzvah that is where he is best invested. It doesn't mean that he doesn't need to do the others. It just means that this is going to be special for him. His soul is attached to that mitzvah in a special way. And that goes back to the idea that every Jew has a letter in the Torah. And so, theoretically, you would say that your letter is in the description of that particular mitzvah. That's how you would say. But when Rav taught this, he said, very interesting, that the two meanings go together. Because you were extra careful, that's why you shone. That makes sense. But if you understand why you were extra careful, then it's exactly what we're saying. Why were you extra careful? When we read this, usually we think there's a mitzvah that I have a special affinity for. There's an area in life that I have a special affinity for. But here what he's saying is, why did you have a special affinity? Because you needed to take extra care there, because you were weak in that area. In that area that you were weak, that's exactly where you can shine. That's what comes out of this. And I've related this many times, the story that I had when I was by the Baal Shem Tov, and I was davening there for my wife and this and that. And I asked the Baal Shem Tov, and that's a discussion, for a different discussion, how do you ask the Baal Shem Tov something? But I asked the Baal Shem Tov, so what did you do with the hole in your chest that both your parents died at an early age? What did you do with it? So the answer that I received there was, again, received in my mind. That's what came up in my mind, the answer. And it wasn't like I heard a voice or something. I'm not like that. But the answer that I came up with was, and that's how these things usually work, that you don't hear a voice, but you receive a certain answer, and you have to think about it, whether it makes sense or not. You can't just blindly trust it. But what I heard was, what I listened in my mind was, that's why I was sensitive to other people. That's all the good that I did, all the chassidus that he taught by the Baal Shem Tov was secondary to all the chesed that he did. Because what he really did was he changed the way that a great man treated others. That until then, the great sages were against, but they were I have the gifts that I have. My duty is to take care of other people. And that's how it is that when there's a Rebbe, when there's a great person, he doesn't dedicate his life to advancing himself, he dedicates his life to helping other people. So as much as he taught great things, his stress in life was on helping people. And so the idea here was that because of the weakness that I had, which was there was no one to take care of me, and he had to run around as an orphan, and basically people gave him food as a charity, but he had no one to take care of him, he had no family. They had no relatives to, even when he got married and he had children, there was no relatives to come and help his wife when she gave birth. And there was no relatives they could go to for Pesach and for Shabbos, and they had nothing. But that itself turned me into a person who feels other people's needs. Because I'm sensitive to it. Because it's my weakness. And because it's my weakness, it became my greatness. Okay, so next time, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll continue with the categories. Thanks very much for joining on Zoom, and for everyone who joined on Facebook. And it should be a happy Yutet Kislev tomorrow and Kaf Kislev. And hopefully everybody will be zocheh to the light of Chassidus.